Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us for day 2 of this incredible Miu Miu Literary Club. So today we are delighted to continue our exploration of a theme of a women's education through the lens of Japan's most formidable literary voices, Fumiko Enchi, an extraordinary novel, The Waiting Years. So before we begin, I'd also love to take this opportunity to thank Mrs. Prada and also Miu Miu for facilitating this and bringing together such an incredible panel and an incredible few days of being able to really delve into some things that I feel like often we don't get the opportunity to do. So I wanted to start to speak a little bit about the author. So for those who aren't familiar with her work, Fumiko Enchi was a very celebrated author and playwright whose writing delves fearlessly into the themes of gender, sexuality, and the emotional terrain of women's life in a patriarchal society. Her voice is rich and bold and draws a lot from classical Japanese literature and folklore. Enchi stands as one of the most important feminist voices in Japanese literature, and this is why it's so important for us to explore this today. The Waiting Years, for those of you who also don't know, is perhaps one of her most important searing critiques of Japanese patriarchal family systems. At the heart of the novel is Tomo, a dutiful wife who's caught in the machinery of social expectation. And over the decades, we witnessed Tomo managing the household of her husband and who's a cold, domineering figure. And this is kind of the framework. And it's also set in a time in which we look into the traditional household structures that, I guess, dehumanized women. The novel invites us to reflect upon a lot of complex themes, female solidarity, rivalry, and resistance, loyalty, and loss. I think all of those themes are things that we are constantly thinking about today, and urges us to speak and think about them slightly more. So I wanted to start by introducing a wonderful friend and a wonderful face, Cindy Bruner, to read an extract from The Waiting Years. So please join us.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, guys. Okay. As she gazed at the innocent body of this girl, who, for all the provocative movements, the inclinations of the head and the elusive movements of the body, with which she suggested the amorous affairs of men and women on the stage, was in fact still half a child. Tomo found herself wondering in what way this immature girl would be broken in, how she would be transformed once they took her to their home and delivered her into the practiced hands of Shiwakawa. Unconsciously, she closed her eyes and held her breath, only to see a vision of her husband and Suka, with limbs intertwined that brought the blood rushing to her head and made her open her eyes wide again, as though to dispel a nightmare. Pity welled up at the sorry fate of the girl fluttering before her like a great butterfly, and with it a jealousy that flowed about her body in a rapid, scorching stream. Her mind, that under the pressure of the search had felt nothing so long as no suitable woman had presented herself, was suddenly assailed with a yearning like the hunger that comes with the ending of a fast. The pain of having to publicly hand over her husband to another gnawed at her within. To Tomo, her husband, who would quite happily cause his wife such suffering, was a monster of callousness. Yet, since to serve her husband was the creed around which her life revolved, to rebel against his outrages would have been to destroy herself as well. Besides, there was the love that was still stronger than that creed. Tormented by the one-sided love that gave and gave with no reward, she had no idea even so of leaving him. It was true that Shirakawa's money and property their daughter Etsuko and their son Mishimasa, now living with relatives in the country, were bonds that held her. But still, stronger was the longing, whatever the sacrifice, to have her husband understand through and through the innermost desires and emotion of her heart. The longing was something that no one other than Shiwakawa could fulfill. At the idea of another woman, this young girl, Suka, coming between herself and her husband, it seems to Tomo that the husband with whom, even in the past, she had never been able to effectual contact, was moving still farther away. The night after she received his reply conveying approval of the photograph of Suka that she had sent, Tomo dreamed that she killed the husband and woke in fright at the sound of her own cry. Even after she awoke, the force that had gone into her hand to strangle him was still vividly apparent in her clenched fist. She sat up in bed, appalled at herself, and stayed for a while, hugging her body with her arms.
Thank you. So, thank you so much, Cindy, for reading, and I hope that gives us slightly more of an understanding of the rebellious, poetic, incredible work, and urges you all to read more and more at home. I wanted to invite you all to say hello to our incredible panelists. So firstly, I'm just going to introduce you. So firstly, we have Naoise Dolan, who's an acclaimed Irish writer born in Dublin. Her novels, Exciting Times and The Happy Couple, have been translated in over 30 languages and shortlisted for the Women's Prize and the Dylan Thomas Prize, and many, many more. Her critical writing has appeared in London's Review of Books, the New York Times, and the Guardian and Irish Times. Next, Nicola Dinan, whose debut novel, Bellies, who won the Polaroid First Book Prize and was recognized across a range of major literary awards. Her latest work, Disappoint Me, continues to build on her reputation as one of the most exciting new voices in fiction. And finally, Sarah Manguso, an American author and novelist of the books Liars and Very Cold People, along with several non-fiction works, including 300 Arguments, Ongoingness, and The Guardians. Her work has been honored with the Guggenheim Fellowship and the Rome Prize and international acclaim. So just like a round of applause for our incredible panelists. So I wanted to start, I guess, with a question for you all. And so Fumiko Enchi and The Waiting Years is a masterpiece of Japanese literature, of course. And Enichi's voice does stand out amongst some of the first writers questioning the aspects such as the male gaze and female desire that still today are often dismissed from women's sentimental and sexual education. So I just wanted you all to let us know, how did this reading resonate with you each?
Yeah, so I think I was struck on a couple of levels. The first at how a piece of writing which was published in the 1950s but tells a story set in the late 19th century feels so contemporary. Mm-hmm. There are ways in which it relates. I related it to my own family. I'm Chinese Malaysian and my grandmother was a concubine, as it might be described. And my mum is a child of the second branch of the family. And so it was really interesting to be able to frame my own family dynamics in the context of what was written in Enchi's work. But also, when we think about the dynamics between women, the ways in which our desires as women may implicate the fulfillment of other women's desires and the dissolution of solidarity, all of those themes felt really contemporary and very modern. But I suppose that's sort of a feature of literature generally. We're reading books from 300, 400 years ago even, and we're finding that many of the issues, or rather there's a sort of consistency in human nature across those works.
Yeah, it always seems to come back around, and there's a full circle and cyclical way about it.
Absolutely.
And I think that was like one of the main things that I gathered from this text, which was that it felt so current and it felt so appropriate to now. And I think that is something as well that everyone will be able to universally take home from, hopefully today as well, of exploring this a little further. Nish, did it resonate with you in a similar way?
Deeply, and I was struck by your use of the word poetic earlier, because I think there's a real distillation of the experiences described in the text to their specific context, and an unapologetic narrowing of the focus to that. So towards the end, there's a brilliant sentence where the 3 or 4 years of war that have just been happening with Europe are mentioned in passing, in order to explain why the geishas are now doing better business and are all blinged out. And that confidence that if you describe a given setting well enough with caring enough detail, it will resonate to people beyond it, people in other cultures and other times. It's so palpable throughout the text, and that care, that detail, it almost viscerally, the snakes, the caterpillars, it's all so grounded in the real, and I think through that, it manages to make some really profound feminist points without it ever being laboured or overly intellectualised. It's a deeply evocative book in that sense. It got me thinking, but it got me feeling as well.
I think that is it. It leaves you with this almost like residue of feeling, and that is something that I think is so powerful when we're looking at especially this time period in which from when written to current, and that feeling of it still feeling relevant today. Sarah, what did you agree with this, or what else resonated for you?
Very much. I was trying to sort of diagnose the quality of its timelessness, and for me, what was so notable about it, in being a description of an earlier time, is that as much as the male gaze sort of determined the main events of the plot, the women were always gazing back. And even in positions of materially much less power than the men that surrounded them, all of the women were just they were rendered as just being extremely skilled in maximizing the amount of agency that they could have over their lives and over their daughters' lives, and over what got to happen. And it just seemed exactly like what women do now. And the conversations that I have with women who have been painted into a corner by the patriarchy, by marriage or professionally, and it just seemed like exactly the same kind of calculated skill. And it was shocking and pleasurable to see that.
Exactly. No, 100%. And I love the idea of timelessness, because I think often we look at issues or themes and we pin them to one particular moment, and we don't realize that even though the current situations and the ideas and perceptions can change, there are things and there are themes and there are issues that will always exist. And I think slowly but surely, especially having such a presence of writers now who are combating the male gaze and who are subverting it and looking at it in new ways, such as yourselves. It's important, because we are allowing kind of the next generation to have that timelessness from your work as well, which is kind of what I wanted to move into. I wanted to talk about the master text in relation to your personal work. And I want to start, Nisha, with you, and in Enchi's work, The Weightiest and Exciting Times by You, the protagonists find themselves trapped in these relationships that are unfulfilling, and they feel compelled to maintain for various reasons. Tomo seems to be bound by societal expectations, and yet she acknowledges that. And Ava in Exciting Times appears to be both financially and emotionally dependent on Julian. And I wanted to speak to you about how these two women struggles, particularly in terms of how Ava navigates that tension between personal desires and societal roles, and a sense of emotional duty in her relationships, how those characters you feel are in relation or resonate with one another?
Well, I think our discovery of Tomo's character is quite different in the sense that her interiority comes to us bit by bit over time, and we're able to build up this incredibly complex woman through how others see her as much as anything else, until the devastating finale where her full fury and rage is brought out. Whereas I think in my depiction of Ava, because she's this quite intense first-person narrator, that fire is there from the beginning, and so it's less a journey of seeing how much anger and how much calculation are going on beneath the surface, and more being with her for the entirety of it. And I suppose as well, the material circumstances are different. I think Ava is maybe more of a pragmatist who, if she truly wanted to, could choose a different life that was not so based on depending on a man, whereas unclear what else Tomo could have done. She seems to be genuinely making the best of an extremely narrow and depressive lot. But I do think maybe there's a commonality in the refusal to judge female pragmatism and refusal to condemn people for doing what makes sense in the framework that they're operating within, however coercive or relatively loose that framework might be. We're all making choices that are conditioned by what's available to us, and I think writing about that with compassion and curiosity is far more interesting than trying to pin women down as collaborators or whatever other simplistic framing one could have.
Exactly. I mean, survival is only survival in terms of what it's frameworked by, and I think that's such an important element of the text as well. I wanted to speak to you, Nicola, about in the waiting years, the women of the household, they experience this complex web of relationships that are shaped by patriarchal oppression, and they share like a common subjugation and power imbalances. But I wanted to speak to you in contrast and disappoint me. The relationships between the protagonist and Simone demonstrates a kind of friendship that transcends into romantic love, and even, you know, taking on characteristics of romanticism itself. How do you see the contrast between these two portrayals of relationships? You know, one marked by division and rivalry, and the other fostering this idea of solidarity and emotional intimacy outside of the traditional boundaries of romance.
Yeah, so in Disappoint Me, the main character, Max, is trans, and her best friend, Simone, is gay. And so they've known each other since they were extremely young. And I think in many senses, I find it funny that my books are described as love stories, almost in quite a traditional sense, mainly because my first book was actually a breakup novel. And then my second book actually is, I think the enduring love story of it is actually friendship between Max and Simone. And so the contrast there is that they exist sufficiently outside of the expectations of heteronormativity, where I don't think they see each other as competitors, as the women in the Shirakawa household might do, for example. But I wouldn't say that their relationship or friendship or the way that they exist is necessarily free of patriarchal oppression. And in that sense, it's actually quite similar. I think, you know, Max and Simone are extremely close, but sort of a focal point of Disappoint Me is that they've got to go to their school friend's wedding. And this wedding is sort of an aggressively heterosexual wedding that they're all sort of dreading. And Max and Simone are actually quite nasty about their friends from school. And there's a way in which, although they've formed solidarity with one another as a result of their shared difference, being queer women in a world that largely isn't queer, so that solidarity is often used as a tool to deride the straight women in their lives. And that's not good either. Yeah. That's sort of, I think, in a similar way, patriarchal forces operating for Max and Simone to justify the lives that they live through the denigration of the lives that other women live. And although you could argue it's not as sinister as what's happening in the Shirakawa household, where you have maybe an outdated form of concubinage, a clear patriarch, I wouldn't say that it's a relationship that has transcended those boundaries. But I do think, what I hope my books do is work in the project of deprioritizing romantic love in the context of the friendships that we have. I've always found that after a breakup, the thing that hasn't healed me is, for example, the half marathon I ran that gave me a serious knee injury. The thing that's actually really helped is the recognition of how my friendships with other women and how long I've had those friendships and how long I'll continue to have them. And at least in Max and Simone, we see the seed of something that could be revolutionary. But I think what the book also explores is the fact that it's not quite there yet.
Yeah, and I love the idea that, there is so much. I always say, like, platonic love has saved my life so many times, because there is something about it in which there is a consistency. There's a separation of that reactive emotional fuel that comes with love, and this ability to be able to reflect and be truly seen. And I think friendship allows you to be truly seen and to truly see without your own expectations of that person, ruining that in some way.
Yeah, it's a sense of security, right? And I think when we look at the waiting years, what the women in the Shirakawa household lack is a sense of security, whether that's through their ability to own property, live independent lives that doesn't depend on winning the affections of this cold patriarch. And at the very least, I think Max and Simone's relationship represents a certain kind of security. But what I was actually really touched by in the waiting years were the relationships between the concubines outside of Suga and the bonds that they were able to form outside, at least with each other in the face of their shared oppression within the household, even if by the hands of another woman.
Yeah. Exactly. No, that it's such a powerful dynamic to explore. Going on to you, Sarah, I wanted to also speak about, obviously, your work in relation to this text. And in the waiting years, Tomo's experiences reflect deep emotional and personal costs of maintaining honor and stability within this rigid patriarchal society, and her sacrifices framed as acts of loyalty, a tinge with profound loss. In Liars, the protagonist navigates a similarly oppressive patriarchal landscape where the allure of masculine power traps both men and women in cycles of control and sacrifice. And I wanted to ask you, how do you feel these two characters reflect the same struggle with the patriarchal societies enforcing self-sacrifice and emotional loss, whilst also shaping the dynamics of the power within those relationships?
That's such a good question. And really the main question that I had for myself after reading the Enchi novel was, how does the protagonist of my book, Liars, how does she get to be so angry when she has materially such a better position in the world? Tomo goes to marry her husband when she's all but illiterate and 14, and the protagonist of my book is somebody who's educated, who has a profession, who could legally leave her husband at any time. And yet her rage was just so vast and so uninterrupted. And the answer that I came up with is that Tomo lives in a kind of patriarchal society in which there was general acceptance of the terms of it. So everybody, seemed to accept. I mean, of course, the women know that they are fully human, but they are forced to live within the confines of these patriarchal family structures. And so Tomo takes money from her husband, finds him a concubine, more concubines appear, philandering takes place, but all of it is accepted as part of the, the normal behavior of men and women. Whereas I think the thing that makes Jane so angry in my novel, is not the fact that she is so far underneath her husband's thumb as Tomo is under Shirakawa's, but because Jane is living in a society that's telling her that feminism is no longer necessary. And sort of the way that patriarchy is so overt in the Enchi novel and in the representation of that time, it's like an agreed upon reality, whereas Jane is living in a place that's telling her, you have all the power, why don't you just leave? When of course there are just all of these absorbed passive messages that are fed to her insidiously all her life that contradict this sort of basic material freedom that she's being told she has, that she does in fact have.
Yeah, and I find it really empowering when we use the word rage. There's something I think about rage that we are taught to step away from and to not lean into. And I wondered, just on reflection of what you just said, like what did you tap into yourself as well to encapsulate that rage? Like, did you feel like you tapped into your personal experiences, and were these conversations that you had with friends? Like, I would love to know your process about that, because I think especially in literature that centers or subverts the male gaze, rage is something that is a really interesting vehicle.
Yeah, I love rage. I seem to have an infinite supply of it, and I'm lucky that it impels me to write books. Yeah, Liars is like all of my books. All of my books come out of they don't come out of a thought. They come out of a feeling, and a feeling is necessarily personal, even if it's a feeling about something happening outside of your own body. So yeah, in that way, all of my books are alike. I'm simply writing about my feelings, which, when put in those terms, it sounds as if I'm making fun, but I'm really not. I'm writing about my feelings. I mean, it's all I've ever done since I was 14 years old, and I'm very lucky to be able to do it in this in this milieu right now. But the way that Liars was written, I did not write it chronologically. The book begins with a sort of low simmer that just sort of achieves a boil. It has a different sort of chronology of anger from the Enchi novel, which is sort of like very skillfully kept under the surface, and then comes out in this like beautifully aestheticized moment at the end. I wrote the angriest part of my book first, and then once I don't know, I think once my actual personal rage level went down to a manageable amount, then I was able, then I was able to write about anything other than rage.
Yep.
So the last third came out first, and then the rest of it I was able to fill in.
That's such an interesting process that you start there, almost like you start at the crescendo.
Yeah, it was unplanned. I wouldn't say this is the best way to write a novel, to do the ending first, but I don't know, maybe you all have other ideas. But that's how this book came to be.
Amazing, amazing. I just wanted to explore a few other things. Nisha, at 22, your protagonist Ava is leaving behind her girlhood and assessing the values that she's choosing to build her adult years upon. And I want to explore with you and ask you in question the idea of the autonomy that the choice seems stunned, and that Ava is posed with the possibility of a decision or an alternative. And how do you feel that Ava's ending, girlhood, is different from the Shiraka girls and women's? Like, what values do you, I guess, see that they share across time and not?
I think it is rooted in girlhood because Something I find fascinating the more distance I have from that novel is how much agency I had in my own life while I was writing it. Not least because I was writing a novel. That's one of the highest agency things that you can do. No one will ever beat your door down begging you to write a novel. It's not a highly demanded thing. You have to really want to do it for yourself before anyone else cares at all. And then maybe several years later, some people will care, not before then. So despite being myself a high agency individual, why did I gravitate towards depicting someone who didn't have that drive or that confidence? And I think it's because of that stage of life, and where I see that in Enchi's work too. It's not that these women don't make decisions, but as they progress, you see them more and more defined by their choices, even within the narrow set available to them. Whereas at the outset, all of them with their marriages seem to, it's not that they go in unintelligently or naively, but it is stressed throughout the novel that even if they might be intelligent people inherently, they've just not been formed to think about these things and to imagine different choices. And so while my protagonist's circumstances are different, she's university educated, she's nominally living in feminist times. Maybe what you were saying, Sarah, about that disjuncture, I find that quite interesting. I think nowadays female rage is less about discovering for yourself the patriarchy is unjust while everyone else thinks it's great. Yeah. It's that everyone says it's horrible and we all keep doing it, and that why, ma perché, and we just keep going. And so I think maybe I wanted to start the character in some kind of uncertainty so that the rage wouldn't bubble immediately. And that's what I see Enchi doing too. We have to start these women, if not diffident, then certainly silent in whatever misgivings they have, because if you have all the rage at the start, it's just not a narrative arc. You need a book to go up and then down. And so I think that's the journey of girlhood too, in a way. The reconciling your own experience with what you've been taught to expect is how the world works.
100%. And I guess it's also that era of your life in which you feel these feelings of, like, you know, outside of teenage angst, which I think is a universal experience that we probably all have, but this idea of like learning yourself and understanding autonomy, but also being juxtapositioned with being in spaces in which, like, even, I don't know, especially when we talk about education, schooling systems in which you're told, I don't know, you have to put your hand up to go to the bathroom, but you're also being asked at the same time to understand what it is to step into this new idea of womanhood, and maybe sometimes in a way that feels like you're slightly ill-equipped to, and I do think there's such a power that comes with that understanding of that rage and how to utilize it to really, whether it's change your circumstances or shape your future or destiny. And I think that feeling of that is so important, and I think it will resonate with generations for years to come too. I also wanted to speak, Nicola, in Disappoint Me in the Waiting Years. They share like a curious similarity. They portray this experience of research and selection, each made particularly awkward because it involves the idea of choosing other people according to a series of requirements and features. Max swipes through like dating apps to find a suitable partner for herself, and Tomo starts an in-person scouting for a potential mistress that would, suit her husband's needs. And I wanted to speak to you about what kind of force this is, like this idea of like the unmet expectation, and is it necessarily negative to affect that? Is there a negative effect in it in both novels?
Yeah, so maybe to give a bit of context about what happens in my novels, the main character Max falls down the stairs at a New Year's Eve party, wakes up in hospital, and her first thought is, I need to find a boyfriend, which is, spells the death of feminism, really. And she finds herself really looking for a man to fill this sort of hole in her life, and she's engaging in this process of flattening this man that she meets, Vincent, and reducing him to a role. And it's interesting comparing that to the waiting years, because we see Tomo doing that with the concubines, which she conscripts into the household. And I think what Tomo has to do, or at least my interpretation of how Tomo maneuvers in this way, is by denying, in her eyes, these women a full sense of personhood. And there are several moments in the waiting years where you can always sense that Tomo is struck by the full sense of these women's personhood. They have a full set of desires. They want things from herself, and they present an insecurity and a threat to the security of the household. And that is very uncomfortable for Tomo, and it seems to create a sense of guilt. And I think similarly with Max, the sort of comedic start to the novel, but it's ultimately quite a dark story of things her partner has done in the past that come to light, that muddy his image as sort of an enlightened 21st century man. And this involves sort of an act of violence against a trans woman in 2012. And this similarly, very understandably results in disappointment for Max. But in both cases, disappointment is a result of an extension of someone's character. There's a line in my second book, which is, there comes a point where you can't deny the bones their flesh. And I think that's sort of true of getting to know anyone. I don't think it's interesting thinking of disappointment as an emotion.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's something where by definition it's sort of negative. I would love to meet someone for whom disappointment is a positive emotion. If that is you, please come find me after. I'd love to pick your brain, or maybe encourage you to reach out to some researchers. And I think, there's a sense of, it feels sort of an intrinsically negative emotion, but that doesn't mean that disappointment has to be a negative force. Actually, I think, there are several emotions, like disappointment, for example, which can be incredibly instructive in how we treat others and how we accept other people's personhood. I think Tomo struggles with that over the course of the novel. We see her weave in and out of the recognition of the other women in her home, and I sort of sense that maybe this manifests in her own body towards the end of the novel. But I think we at least have a more positive treatment of disappointment as a positive force in my second novel, which is maybe fundamentally a reflection of the different times in which we find ourselves, in which, maybe conditions have opened up as such where actions can be taken in which disappointment can become a more productive force. Because, as we sort of said, in many ways, though Tomo might not act in the interest of the women in her home, there are many ways in which her hands are tied by the system in which she is a part. And so that it's another sort of striking moment of intense similarity and difference between two novels sort of 70 years apart.
Yeah, 100%. And I love that also with disappointment also comes so much clarity. And often, it brings this truth out in a way, like whether that is the good, the bad, or the ugly. Selfishly, I've been able to talk to you guys for the entirety of this, and I do want to open up the floor to also, I'm sure, a lot of buzzing questions. But before we get there, just really quickly, I would love to ask you all like a general question, and maybe we could start with you, Sarah. And I just wanted to know, do you think that reading and writing about women's desires can be empowering for women, and to what extent the sex and love education that you had whilst growing up has been challenged by literature? I would love to, close on that before we open to the audience.
I'm going to answer that in reverse, I think. I grew up in Massachusetts in the 1970s, and my friends who grew up in New York and California tell me that it was effectively like I grew up in the 1950s, because, and it wasn't just because I was living in a smaller place, but because, there really are very antiquated ideas that I was presented with, and I always felt this sort of doubleness growing up, because I recognized that I was a fully human person, but all of the real life examples given to me by my family, by the people in my town, by really the extent of my reality as a kid, were that my fate was to be a wife and a mother, neither of which I wanted to be. So, you know, of course, personally, literature is an escape. Art is always an escape for young people growing up in small places. And the second part of your question, I think it's sort of like it's deceptively direct, but I think, you know, yes, literature in which women are depicted in all their fullness as human beings is, of course, going to be buoying to women who read it and talk about it, but I think the more that such books make their way into the popular conversation, it's, at least in the United States, the statistics say that men don't read books by women, or they don't buy books by women. That's the more American thing to examine. But quite seriously, though, I think that the more that women talk about these books, of course, is good for women, but I think it's more important that these types of conversations are normalized so that they make their way into more heteronormative, more patriarchal spaces, and so it just becomes taken for granted that women should be exactly as human as the most conservative man.
Exactly. No, completely agreed. And Isha, I wondered if you would echo that, or what your personal growing up experiences that were challenged in literature or in writing yourself, in your process of it.
Yeah, well, similarly, I'm an Irish Catholic, so my sex education was just like, don't. E basta. And so in that sense, almost anything that I could possibly read was going to challenge that just by sex being present. Because it wasn't discussed in the environment, it was made as invisible to us as possible. And there's a real shame that comes with that, even for my generation, very few of whom are explicitly religious in any way. And so I think it's important then that sex and that female experiences more broadly be written about, but I'm cautious at the same time of the pigeonholing and pressure that can come from that. I sometimes feel that these are the only things that I'm expected to have authority on. And I've noticed when I'm being commissioned for journalism, say, female editors are far more likely to ask me to write about politics, about literary criticism on other topics, about anything else that they've seen that I've written about previously that isn't sex, whereas men are much likelier to go, I think something might be in your immediate personal experience, why don't you write about that? And so the answer, obviously, is that women should be writing about everything because we are not in any meaningful sense a minority, so it would be bizarre if we were not half of what is published on any given subject. And we are getting there, but a lot more to do, I guess, like always.
The steps are in place, but there's a lot more walking to get to before. And I just wanted to finish the same question to you and what your personal experience was, but also, I guess, what came up in writing this, and also responding, even in thinking about responding to this text for yourself.
Absolutely. I think, similar to what Nisha and Sarah said, I think, if shame is the fountain, I think desire is often the water that runs through it. It's what we feel, we're made to feel ashamed about our desires. And I think growing up, I've often reached to books to sort of destroy conceptions of an internal sense of wrongness that I think many queer people have, many women suffer with, and I think literature is such a powerful way to do that. But in reading The Waiting Years, I think it kind of expanded my sense of what desire is. I think we're used to talking about desire in kind of a sexual desire, but I think The Waiting Years frames desire as sort of like an inherently interpersonal thing. It looks at like the tensions between one person's desire and another. And I think when we write about desire, it's really important to place that in a broader context, even a global context. Even the desire to be here, like, did you fly here? What are the implications of fulfilling that desire? And I think, when we're thinking about what Nisha said about women being able to write more expansively, maybe a route to write more expansively about desire is the consideration of desire beyond that which is sexual.
Yeah, 100. I was speaking earlier in one of the interviews, and they said, what do you desire most? And I said, freedom. to desire. That is it. And I feel like all three of you, and of course in Fumiko's work, that is it. Like the desire to have like self-autonomy and to have freedom and those things that all of us, I think everyone in this room also have, hopefully at the top of their desire list, amongst maybe some other things as well. But thank you so much for my questions, because I feel like I feel so inspired and I feel so honored to be able to do this with all three of you. And I wondered if anyone from the audience had any questions, because we have some roaming mics. Yes. We'll just start here.
Hi, I'm David. My question is for you, and I don't want to mispronounce your Irish name. I'm sorry.
Nisha.
Nisha. I went to school with a Siobhan, and it took me a while. Your comment about, like, you know, we're this modern generation, we're aware of the patriarchy, and we just keep doing it anyway. I'm reading a book by David Graeber right now, the anarchist philosopher, and the title of it's a compilation of his essays, and it's called The Ultimate Hidden Truth of the World, and it's an excerpt from one of his most famous essays, and the rest of that sentence is that the world is something we make, and we could just as easily make it in a different way. So my question is, if we're stuck in the patriarchy, and we're all aware of it, and we just keep doing it, why is it so difficult to, like, get off the tracks and onto something else? And in regards to the book that we're talking about today, I spent some time in Japan, like maybe like 6 months total, working there. And I live in Scandinavia, and both societies to me feel very much driven by a sense of public shame. Like, they work so well as societies because there's this deep sense of, like, I can't step out of line lest someone thinks something ill of me. So my question to you is, how do you get off that track? Like, is there a way for female desire to, like, disentangle itself from shame and hop onto a different rails and make a different world? And how do you use that to empower that change?
Yeah, but thank you for a very thoughtful question. I suppose I'd start by saying, like a complete lack of sex education, as an Irish person, shame is a topic not unfamiliar to me. My mother went to a convent school where they spoke a lot of Irish, and the nuns would constantly say, "Manoirahu," literally, "you are my shame." And that was a normal thing to say to children. Like, not your child, a child that you were educating. And so I don't think that's unique to misogyny, obviously. There are so many things that shame feeds into, but I wonder if shame is an aspect of why we don't make more progress, because if thinking critically about your choices and the society you're in is something that makes you feel bad, naturally you're not going to want to do it in any sustained sort of way. You might pay lip service here and there, but if the way that you practice feminism is by criticizing yourself and thinking negatively of others and assuming the worst of everyone and indulging in pessimism and despair, then that's not something realistically that anyone is going to want to stay immersed in long term, unless they're addicted to unhappiness, which some people are. And so there has to be some kind of way to be optimistic without being completely foolish and naive. And I can't spell out exactly what that would look like at each individual level, but that's broadly the approach that I try to take. I try to take reasonable account of what's actually going on around me, but then think, what marginally here and there can I do to make a difference without inflating how far that will go. I mean, Veronica Raimo the other day at yesterday's event acknowledged very valuably, we are sitting with the tension of working with a luxury brand to talk about women's literary work, and I feel quite positive about that choice. I feel like we're having a productive discussion about an author who isn't as well known in Italy as she should be, and we're working with the resources that we're given. And I think Olga has put together a couple of beautiful panels to do that. And so I think if we can make our choices while thinking about the collective, while being realistic about the limitations of what those choices will achieve, but trusting that others will do the same, and I suppose holding each other, I don't like the word accountable. Accountable is so punitive, like you'll go to jail for being a bad feminist. You don't even go to jail for raping women. You're not going to go to jail for being a bad feminist. And so accountable is not the word, but maybe being collective about our desires to make the world better. I think if we talk to people about these things, that gives us so much faith that others are doing the same and are trying to make those changes. And if you trust and know that others are doing what they can as and when they can, it's easier to keep doing your bit too.
Agreed. Do we have another? Oh, can we grab the mic over here? Do we have another on this side? We have two at once.
Hi. Thank you all for coming. This was really great to sit and listen to. My name is Demi, and I was wondering, well, so as we heard, or you guys all discussed, and she managed to write so honestly about the desires, both sexual and otherwise, of women in a time and place where such topics were considered taboo. And so I was wondering, while these subjects have become more generally accepted throughout society, do you still find that there's risk in exploring these topics and how you deal with any pushback you may face?
Who wants to start?
I can start.
Yeah.
I find that as I age, I find less pushback simply because I think accumulated experience calms people, it calms me down, although that could be menopause too. No, but in all seriousness, it's a funny thing. We were just talking in the green room about the subjective feeling of aging is not that you're gradually aging. It's that, like, you know, I really felt 35 when I turned 35, and then I haven't really thought about it since then. Now I'm 51. So, like, it's in the same way, I don't really, it's like I've edited out the pushback. But I'd be really curious to hear from the younger women about how things feel.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the fear exists on two levels for me when I publish a book. Like, there's like the macro fear, and I'm, you know, a trans woman in mainstream publishing. Like, there aren't a huge number of us, and so a lot of the times, particularly in the current political climate, there's a huge sense of anxiety. You know, we were talking about books being published in the US, for example, and going over there, and, you know, I'm definitely not traveling to the US to promote this new book that I have coming out in May. And so there's a terror of and fear of backlash when it comes, because of the subject matter that I'm writing about, that at least in a literary context and a mainstream literary context is relatively novel. But there's also the micro fear that I feel will never go away, no matter how far thinking goes with respect to feminist issues or the like, which is the worst thing about publishing a book, is that everyone you know will see themselves in it. And it's so annoying. And you spend the entire time after publication telling people that isn't you. I know someone who's in New York who insists to this day that he's a character in my first novel. And the harder you push back on it, the harder they believe it. But the consequence of that is that there's a huge sort of in your own life, a consequence of publishing, where it can have a huge impact on your relationship and often relationships around you, whether that's your relationship with your partner, your relationship with your family. And interestingly, that's the kind of blowback which often hits the hardest, because they're people who know you. And I think that's sort of a consequence of writing. You know, when we're choosing about things to write, we're often choosing of events of interest. And I think events of interest are rarely the property of just one person. You know, we're writing about shared experiences. And the consequence of that is that people might respond to it in quite a personal way. And so that fear was always going to be there, I think.
I do think, though, the nice thing about our generation is they're all complete cowards. So very rare that someone will say something nasty to your face.
Yeah.
Maybe if you're close, but complete strangers, absolutely not. That would require them to have the social skills to even do that. And most of them went completely feral during the pandemic and don't know how to talk to people. So I find if you don't look at your phone, the presence of backlash in the first place is so minimal. Because in real life, people invite you to things if they like your work. People show up for those things if they like your work. And That's not to say I don't pay attention to criticism. I read some of my reviews, not all, but I feel very strongly that we are not meant to know what everyone thinks about us at all times. And the invention of technology that enabled this was very bad. We evolved to meet maybe 200 people over the course of our entire lifetimes within maybe a small village. And instead, if you publish a book and it does well, thousands of strangers' opinions are yours for free, whether you want them or not. So just not looking at notifications helps me deal with it a lot. But I think in terms of people I actually know, it helps that I'm a tactless and inconsiderate person. So I just don't think about it while I'm writing, how it might affect someone else. And once it's out, it's out. I can't take it back. And I never learn from it. I never be more diplomatic writing the next one, which is not great for my personal relationships, but it's great for my writing. So I don't really want to change it.
Exactly. I find it funny because it's always like, oh, your worst critic's yourself, your worst critic's yourself. My worst critic is not myself, it's a stranger on Goodreads. And so who are way meaner about my book than I would ever be about my own work. And so much of it is learning when to turn off and when to turn on.
100%. I think that self-preservation is something that's so important. And ultimately, I always think that, you know, if something isn't for someone, there's a reason that it doesn't resonate with them, and not everything should be for everyone. And that is the beauty of art, and especially literature as well. I wish that we had another hour to delve into more questions, because I'm sure you all have them. But unfortunately, this is the end of today's session. So I just want us to put our hands together for the incredible panelists. And also, actually, a very, very, very important person in this, which is Olga, who was so important in this. So thank you very, very much. Thank you to Cindy, and thank you to all of you for being here. I hope you feel as inspired as the rest of us. Thank you so much.